Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Welcome to everyone who is joining us. Welcome to UBC Public Humanities Hub Public Scholarship Speaker Series, co-hosted with the University of Victoria's Visual Storytelling and Graphic Art in Genocide and Human Rights Education. I'm Andrea Webb, the co-director of the project and a faculty member in the Faculty of Education at UBC. We want to begin by acknowledging that UBC is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people, land on which we are uninvited guests. We are grateful to be able to do this work here, and because today's conversation is virtual, we invite attendees to acknowledge the territories from which they're joining us today as part of our opening. Today's event is the sixth in a series about art and testimony that the Public Humanities Hub and UVic are sponsoring. Check out the Public Humanities Hub website for more information on our previous events. We are joined by our SSHRC Partnership Grant co-applicant, Dr. Raey Chapman, who is a professor of English at UBC, specializing in American literature and transnational American studies, suffrage literature and activism, women's poetry, periodicals, digital humanities, and public humanities. She will be facilitating and moderating today's webinar and discussion. Turn it over to you, Mary. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. I'd like to welcome everybody today to the webinar, The Art of Comics Engaged Research. I'm going to start by introducing our speakers, and then I'll turn it over to them so they can present their research on how visual methods, such as comic drawing, have a unique capacity to explore and document human stories in the past and present. So Cal Smith is a first-year PhD student at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and he's the holder of a UBC PhD fellowship with the Survivor-Centered Visual Narratives Project. His research explores early Canadian queer comics in self-published and collective zines from the 1980s and 1990s. And in that research, he takes up questions of ephemerality, visibility, presentations of the self, and archival ethics and policies. Raey Costain is a second-year PhD student in visual anthropology at the University of Victoria. Their research explores the creation and application of drawing-led ethnographic research methods to questions of identity, creative development, and personal well-being. They hold a certificate in therapeutic arts from the Canadian International Institute of Art Therapy, and they seek to apply the therapeutic potential of art making to social research in their dissertation work, exploring graduate student experiences with academic stress. Since 2023, Raey has held concurrent PhD fellowships with the Survivor-Centered Visual Narratives Project and the Smythe Chair in Arts and Engagement. So here's the outline of the program today. We'll begin with an art activity guided by Raey, and then both Cal and Raey will share some of their recent research. We'll follow that by a 20-minute curated discussion, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A with the audience. So please jot down your questions in the Q&A function, and I'll read from them. Okay, so I'm turning it over to Raey.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Hello. Before we begin our conversation about drawing and comics engaged research, I'd like to take a moment to situate ourselves in a place of making. Anthropologist Tim Ingold describes making as a process of learning from the inside that offers very different insights than simply receiving information that someone else has already developed. And so in order to develop a different kind of understanding of this very broad and complex topic of drawing, I invite you to join us in making something. This is a very brief drawing activity. It doesn't need to be fancy. In fact, it's better if you just kind of take the first thing that pops into your head. And if you, like many of us do, have that little voice in your mind that tells you that you're not an artist or that you can't draw, I invite you to try and just let that go for now as best you can. All you need is a piece of paper, pencil, pen. And if ever you get stuck thinking you aren't sure what to put on the page, I invite you to just focus on the sensation of your pencil across the paper rather than trying to envision some kind of perfect outcome. And if at this point I can invite our supporting attendees back onto their cameras here, we are joining together in a co-creative space. And so it's really lovely when we can see each other a little bit, see each other's faces as we work through this little project. So if everybody can just take a moment to grab what they need in order to do a little bit of drawing here, we will get started. So the first thing that you're going to do is draw 3 squares on your paper that are roughly the same size. They don't need to be perfect. You don't need a ruler. You can work horizontally or vertically, whatever your preference. We all have our squares. For the first square, you're going to look ahead of you and pick out something you can see in your physical environment. So that might be your monitor or the coffee cup on your desk or a stack of notes, whatever first catches your eye when you look up from where you currently are. Do a really quick sketch of that. The looser and freer, the better. We are going to move through this at a pretty decent pace because we don't want to think too much about it. Just kind of let it go. So in your second square, I would like you to draw something that you imagine being behind you. Now, this is kind of a funny one to do on Zoom because obviously we can see what is behind us, some of us in our screens. But without looking, think about what is behind you. This might be what is physically behind you in space, or you can take this less literally and think about something you have put behind you into the past, or even something or someone that stands behind you and has your back. If you have that drawing somewhere where you're happy with it, where you can leave it for now, it doesn't need to be finished. But in your last square, I invite you to think about where your feet are, whatever that may mean for you. You might literally draw your feet or your shoes. You might think about where you are in the world. What land is your feet resting on? Whose territory are you standing on? And as you do this last drawing, just think a little bit about what it means to be where your feet are, however you might take that. Okay, and whenever you find yourself in a place where you can leave it for now, um, there we have it. You've made a 3-panel comic. This is a way of locating yourself in a few different ways. Ideally, drawing ourselves a little bit more closely into the place that we occupy right now. And I know that for many of us, it's very hard to only be in one place at a time. Life is busy, and there are likely a lot of other things on your mind. You might even be multitasking right now while watching this webinar, no judgment. But if you are able to be in the place where you are just for this time that we're gathered today, that can be a really powerful thing when we all join together and make that commitment to each other to be where our feet are. I would like to say thank you to everyone who popped back on their cameras to create with us in this space. I'm not going to pressure you to show me any of your drawings, but you're certainly welcome to if you want to. And I think we will, very nice. Love it. This is my favorite part. Okay, thank you very much. We are now going to move a little bit into the presentation part of this. So I'm going to pull up some slides here and we'll dive into that. Alrighty. So I am very happy to be here today to speak a little bit about how I am taking up drawing in my visual anthropology research as a PhD student. And there are a few key aspects of ethnographic drawing that I'm going to bring forward here in relation to my work with comics. These are by no means the only potentials of drawing, but these are some that have been the most significant in my studies so far. And as a starting point, I need to say that I am not drawing as an artist, but rather as an anthropologist. And for me, what this means is that I'm a little bit less concerned with things like aesthetic or artistic merit. And I'm very much focused on how drawing as a kind of tactile process impacts the way that I think and the way that I understand my work and the stories and the people that I'm engaging with. Drawing for me is really just a way of thinking on paper. And with that, I'm following the lead of other anthropologists who draw not as an art form, but as a thoughtful practice that allows us to see a little bit more. So in my MA research, I began to think about drawing as a process of gathering, of bringing together, and also of being together. It's a deeply relational process, and it requires dialogue, it requires connection with other people, but it's also very personal as it allows me to explore multiple layers of my own experiences in relation to my research. Comic drawing is particularly guiding this gathering approach because the way that comics form drawing works, I can gather multiple timelines. I can gather internal thoughts with things that are said or heard aloud. I can even gather myself into my research context as a character or as an observer or as a narrator. Comics work in layers already. And so in terms of gathering, it's a very apt kind of medium to use for this. And the second piece of the gathering process, this idea of being together, emerges from the slower pace that drawing allows for and in some cases demands. And I'm going to speak a little bit more on that in just a little bit. So the three main drawing potentials I'd like to pull forward in relation to this idea of gathering are drawing for connection, drawing imagination, and drawing for care. I started bringing drawing into my studies during my MA, which took place entirely during the first years of COVID. I couldn't pursue field research and interviews in the usual way. And so instead, I conducted a digital ethnography using the TikTok app. And I was specifically looking at non-binary visuality and representation online. While this process did allow me to connect with people that I might otherwise never have met, it also did set up a lot of challenges. The world of TikTok is very fast, and it doesn't really encourage a lot of thoughtfulness or really connected conversations. You can find them, but that's not really what the app is set up to do. And it was very challenging to overcome the distance that I felt between myself and my tiny isolated apartment and my research participants who were also, for the most part, isolating wherever they were in the world. Drawing out comics of the conversations that I had with people on videos through comments or messages became a way of spending time with those people, with their words, with their facial expressions. And this is when I started thinking about drawing and drawings as kind of gathering places that could explain and in some ways document my fieldwork, but at a slower pace that allowed for a greater sense of connection. So I have a drawing up on my slide here that speaks to this experience. This is one of my participants, Samson, on the right hand of this drawing. And with creating this comic, I've closed some of the distance between us by drawing us in conversation. And while the boundaries of this place where we are gathered were created by the limitations of the smartphone, I've used that as the kind of border that locks us in. We were able to share in dialogue and have really productive conversations, even mediated as they were by this digital world and this digital technology. And drawing these experiences became a way of facilitating and clarifying a sense of connection that is otherwise kind of difficult to show when, you know, I'm staring at my tiny screen and they're staring at their tiny screen, and it's difficult to show the story there in any other way. And now, of course, that I have some distance from this work, this was 2020 to 2022 that I was doing this. I can also see how this potential could be amplified, this potential for connection, by inviting participants and collaborators to draw their side of the work. Something I was aware of then and only continued to grow more aware of in the work I've done since is how much authority I have as the person who is doing most of the drawing. This work might have been a lot different if I was not the only one with a pencil in my hand. Because while drawing and being drawn are linked experiences for this type of work, the sense of connection that I developed through drawing is not necessarily the same as the sense of connection my participants developed through being drawn. Now, for this comic that I'm using as an example, Samson was very positive about it because for them, it did gather up the feeling of us just sitting and chatting together the way that we often did using the app. But I do want to leave the possibility open to follow up this potential for connection with a more co-creative methodology in future work. The second potential, drawing imagination, also came forward during my MA research. And as I mentioned, my digital ethnography was focused on experiences of non-binary visuality and visual identity. And so I did create many comics that explored how non-binary people, including myself, were physically represented or choose to physically represent themselves in the world. And so on this slide, this is an autoethnographic comic that is an example of that. Through drawing, I was able to explore my own visuality and gender presentation in a way that was very useful and affirming. And I also drew out other people's physical visual representation in ways that they told me was affirming for them. But something that I kept running into was the way that many of the non-binary people I was speaking with and the non-binary creators I was encountering on the app pointed to aspects of representation that went far beyond the body. For example, in a conversation about gender envy, which is the experience of witnessing something or someone that you aspire to be like or that you feel would be affirming to your own gender identity, I got many responses that suggested gender envy for disembodied things like rain on cobblestones or a sunlit forest. So many conversations about gender identity circle back to the body in a way that can feel extremely restrictive. And here my community was sharing with me how much broader non-binary visual representation might be. So in this drawing here, I've gathered up a few different gender envy experiences beyond the body that were shared with me. Things like bubble tea or muddy Converse or an old library, the sunlit forest, the rain on cobblestones. And drawing, I think, has this enormous potential to bring forward these aspects of identity that are largely internal and so very challenging to document or observe in other ways. In terms of understanding non-binary visuality, it wasn't enough to consider what people look like. What do they look like in their videos? What do they look like, over FaceTime or something like that? The kinds of visual experiences that were part of non-binary visuality often could not be contained within a body. And so instead, we had to look more into our interior thoughts and find ways of sharing those with each other and connecting over those kinds of interior experiences. And many of these experiences are also fleeting and kind of fragmentary. They're based in feelings that sometimes can't be fleshed out into a whole story. And if they were to be fleshed out, quite literally fleshed out in the body, then they would no longer be as free or as true. The kind of imaginative ephemerality of them was really key here. And to gather this kind of experience into a drawing can maintain some of that fragmentary nature without imposing a kind of artificial wholeness. Anthropologist Michael Taussig talks about the aspects of drawing that can achieve this kind of this fragmentation, saying, quote, drawings come across as fragments that are suggestive of a world beyond, a world that does not have to be explicitly recorded and as is in fact all the more complete because it cannot be completed, end quote. And now Taussig wasn't writing specifically about identity experiences, but the sketchy ephemerality that can be communicated through drawing can gather some of that changeability and possibility of human identity beyond simple bodies. The last potential that I'd like to speak about, which started with my earlier research and has now become the focus of my dissertation research and the work that I'm currently doing, is drawing for care. Alongside my PhD, I have pursued a certificate in therapeutic arts, and the approach to creativity and drawing that emphasizes the affective or emotional experiences of these practices is extremely compelling for me. In relation to the other two potentials I've noted here, drawing was part of what allowed me to stay grounded in my research despite the obstacles that I was dealing with. And in my PhD now, I'm looking at ways that collective and co-creative practices can provide the basis for an ethic of care in anthropology that considers the mental and emotional health of researchers and students. The comic activity we started with is actually an example of drawing-led work that I will be using in my fieldwork because it sets a really interesting tone for a conversation that can go in many, many different directions. Drawing has been explored by other anthropologists, such as Chapman, who I'm quoting on my slide here, as a means of developing an attentiveness with people, as opposed to simply thinking about people or their experiences. So in her words, thinking with the drawn subject involves attentive thinking, becoming engaged mindfully with people and their life world. And in my dissertation work, I'm looking to combine this potential for attentiveness and engagement that already exists as an aspect of ethnographic drawing with therapeutic arts research that might support this potential for care even more. As one example, I'm fortunate to be currently working with a fellow grad student on a project where we're using co-creative practice as the basis of a writing collaboration. During our conversations and brainstorming sessions, we'll sit and draw together on the same piece of paper, following each other's lines and building off what the other has created. And this process creates a very different kind of starting place from which to consider our questions and our dialogues and the literature that we're engaging. It sets up a really interesting and productive rapport, and it is very kind and very caring at its center. And it is guided in that way through our creative engagement. So I've spoken about drawing here as an aspect of ethnographic research with several different potentials for representation, connection, and care. And the biggest takeaway I'd like to leave us with is that drawing does not have to be an intensive art practice per se in order to be productive or useful in research. Comics can be a very approachable and engaging form of drawing because they don't have to be perfect or even complete in order to communicate something. So the barrier of perceived skill or talent or lack thereof is somewhat lessened when I'm asking somebody to make scribble comics with me, as opposed to an art form that appears to be much more exclusionary or technically challenging. And here I'm not at all discounting the technical skill of comic artists. There is an enormous range of what comics can be and what comics can look like. But some of my favorite comics, such as, Moomin or Peanuts, and, I pulled some other examples here just off Instagram. They're very simple and in some ways they're a little bit rough. Somebody's eye is just a dot. The way that grass is just a little check mark. But as a kind of visual language, they do what they're meant to. And the kind of immediacy and openness that rough and simple drawings can bring can be very, very powerful, especially when we are using them to gather up experiences and also to gather together with other people. So thank you for listening. Thank you for making with me. And now I would like to turn things over to Cal, who's going to present a slightly different approach to working with comics in research.
All right. Thank you, Raey. That was really wonderful. And I want to say thank you all for attending. And also, there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes here that I'm really thankful for the people who put this together. So, okay, I'm going to begin. This presentation develops from things that have interested me in my PhD research. Though, as you might imagine, as a first-year PhD, this is all very preliminary prospects and ideas. Still, as such, I want to tell a story about some queer comics I've been interested in from a comics creator whose name is Gary Probe. who drew comics for a queer periodical here in Vancouver from 1993 to about 1996. This is a story in part about comics methodology, about research, and about archives in all their forms. But it's also a story about creating something, about doodling both for fun and for a political message. Before I talk about Probe, I want to start with a quote from Diane Brand's book Theory that's been rattling around in my head for a little bit. The book's narrator, who's also writing a PhD thesis, writes, quote, I am especially interested in how unknown and or unacknowledged histories nonetheless continue to produce symptoms, in how we reproduce the unknown trauma or desire that complicates and structure our lives. What do memories entail? What do they permit? And what do they exclude and prohibit? End quote. I've been thinking about this quote and its relation to the fragments of the things drawn in the past, to ephemera, and then to the archives that house that ephemera. And today I want to talk about one of those fragments, about chasing a comic or a series of comics by Gary Probe. I first encountered Probe's work in a 1993 anthology of queer comics called A Queer Sense of Humor, a collection of lesbian, gay, and bisexual cartoons. The publication is unique in that it's one of the few, if not the only, paperback collections of queer comics published in Canada at the time. The publisher was called the Queer Press Collective, and as far as I know, they only published one other work, which was the collection of Probe's autobiography. A Queer Sense of Humor contains some 20 or so artists from North America and the UK, and I've been slowly making my way through its bibliography over the past couple months as a starting point for some of the work I hope to do. On the topics of methodology here, I've been using this application called ProDrafts that supports an infinite background or Blackboard kind of setup. I'm sure everyone can picture a detective board with all those pins with a map going from one point to another. And sometimes this setup makes me feel like a brilliant kind of detective or a little too obsessed with a niche topic. I've taken a little subsection here, but I promise that you can keep zooming out on the section I'm showing in this thing here, and it gets even crazier. But by the by, Probe is mentioned in the bibliography of A Queer Sense of Humor with a very brief description. It says, quote, Gary Probe is a Vancouver actor and writer. He cartoons for serious fun and will be putting out a greeting card in the near future that will probably continue to keep him independently impoverished, end quote. Inside of this anthology, Probe only has 2 pages, with 3 static drawings that combine long text paragraphs as expressed by a kind of comic avatar / a doodle. And he would continue to use this as I would later find some more of his work. I want to look at one of these examples quickly. So in one drawing, the textual section reads, quote, it's been a rough week. First, I absorbed the notion that the personal is political, and then I heard that Michelle Schacht got married to a man. How much can one woman take, for goodness sake? As is typical with Probe's comics, there's a reference to some kind of contemporary event that Probe has either read in the news or perhaps been talking with his friends about. And I always have to do a little bit of research to figure out what the importance of these contextualized moments. So Michelle Schacht was an American singer-songwriter who had been imagined within a certain queer community to be a lesbian, but then who married a man in 1992. Let's note here that the interplay between that first phrase, the personal is political, and the second idea, that imagining of Michelle Schacht as a lesbian and how her decision to marry a man seemingly defeats this idea. Probe filters these 2 ideas through a comic avatar, I think, to suggest the strangeness that can occur when we read other people's personal decisions, in this case to marry a man, as a political statement that avow or disavow who we parasocially imagined them to be, in this case Michelle Schacht as a lesbian. And I think Probe mixes this with a certain amount of wry humor. There's a silly sudden realization that the personal is political in this case, in such a way that's not overtly critical, but it does question from where these investments and beliefs emerge, and then to what effect they determine how we understand others. There's no hint in the rest of this anthology that Probe published elsewhere. There's no reference to other places to look for his work or possible loose ends other than the fact that he, in the 1990s, lived in Vancouver. So without any other leads, I went on Facebook and I started looking for him. After some searching and some probing, some pondering whether I'd found the right person. Of course, I didn't really want to send a message to somebody and say I found your 1990s comics anthology, But after some pondering, and reflecting, I messaged him. And over Zoom, he was incredibly generous. Over Zoom, we chatted about his experience writing comics for a few years. He never received any formal training, but he would always sketch and doodle for fun. He told me about how he got into publishing comics, the press behind The Body Politic, which was a monthly queer magazine published in Toronto and distributed across Canada, had in 1984 decided to make a tabloid called Extra. I don't actually have any pictures of it yet. And this featured queer news, reviews, and often references to popular culture. In 1993, Extra branched out to form location-specific publications. One of those was called Extra West here in Vancouver. Probe knew, though, through some connections in the queer community at the time, some of the people working at the tabloid, and they encouraged him to publish his drawings and sketches on a bi-weekly basis. Around 1996, Probe stopped publishing comics in Extra West, not because of a lack of interest, but because he simply got caught up in other things, theater, and then he would later take a job. So with the time that I have left, I want to talk about Extra West and Probe's drawings there. Luckily, the city of Vancouver's BC Gay and Lesbian Archives contain Extra West's near-complete collection. The free magazine covered important local, national, and international stories of interest to queer readers here in Vancouver. A few weeks ago, I flipped through some 50 or so volumes of Extra West, which equates to only about 2 years worth, in search of Probe's work. There's something fascinating about encountering Vancouver, which I'm very new to, and also broader queer histories in the 90s in this kind of truncated manner. So in the first issue, there's an ad for Philadelphia, one of the first mainstream Hollywood films to address the AIDS crisis explicitly. A few weeks later, there's a review of it. There's also reference to Dion Brand, who I brought up at the beginning here, long before she wrote her book Theory. She was giving a lecture at UBC about queer writing, though. There's also, across 2 years of the issue, I skimmed innumerable references to the Little Sisters Book and Art Emporium censorship trials, where the bookshop owners accused the Canadian Border Service Agency of censoring queer bodies or queer books that they would import. So I buy groceries at the supermarket across from this bookstore in the West End, and I think a lot about that history as I walk by now. And it's a history I learned a lot about searching through an archive for Probe's work. Issue 20 of Extra West has an article humorously titled Probe Sells Out that mentions that Probe was among a collective of comic artists who sold drawings for Little Sisters Legal Defense Fund. It reads, quote, Probe's original cartoon, drawn on the surface of a white jigsaw puzzle, grabbed $40 for Little Sisters' legal battle against the arbitrary censoring of book shipments by Canada Customs, end quote. The event included comic artists from across Canada and the US, including Chester Brown from Montreal, Colin Upton from Winnipeg, and Roberta Gregory from California. And the event demonstrates Probe's commitment to an involvement in his community and how he used his drawings for meaningful change. So looking through Extra West, my collection of Probe's comics expands from the 3 that I knew about in A Queer Sense of Humor to about 50 or 60. Probe published his series, which he called Probing Thoughts, in almost every issue from 1993 to 1995, and always with the same style, with a significant amount of text alongside a single panel drawing. He's always featured in the first few pages alongside a letter to the editor, and the panel subject almost always comments on contemporary political issues. I want to look at just one example of one little fragment of these drawings. So it's clear in this drawing and others in Extra West that Probe was involved in a long tradition of political cartoons that, as Cherry and George and Sony Loop point out in their book Red Lines, political cartoons in the struggle against censorship function as sites of struggle against systems of power and control. In issue number 4 of Extra West, Probe draws 2 people standing outside of Little Sisters as they say, quote, we gay and lesbian government employees don't have any hidden agenda for affirmative job action. Okay, fine. We wouldn't mind just one little lesbian at Canadian Customs, end quote. So the line makes a jab at border customs and proposes the idea that just a little more representation or involvement in some kind of bureaucratic system could belay the censorship challenges directed at Little Sisters. The sign that Probe has drawn on the building, which says, help us win our court censorship challenge, may have been a real sign, but I think it's more likely that it textually beckons to readers to inform themselves about the trial, but also to support Little Sister's case. After 1996, Probe stopped drawing for Extra West as he was busy with other things. But as he told me in our conversation, he continues to sketch a little. To conclude, I think there's something really significant in those little acts of creation. Through his simple drawings, Probe's work speaks to what Dion Brand calls that unacknowledged history. Yet, Probe's work is just one point of departure. There are dozens of other queer cartoonists in a queer sense of humor, and also dozens more who aren't included there, but are published elsewhere. It's my hope that through extended research with this work, I can uncover some of those histories. Nevertheless, as Brand acknowledges, those histories continue to operate with or without our explicit knowledge of them. Where do those doodles reside then? Sometimes they're in archives, sometimes they're on a sheet of paper stored in a bookshelf, and I think both here are really significant. Thank you. That's my presentation, and I think now Mary's going to come back, and we're going to have a little bit of a discussion and to try and find a couple points of connection between our presentations.
Thank you so much, Cal and Ray. That was super. Now I'm going to open it up to you two. I think you have questions to ask one another, so go for it. Who wants to start?
I'd love to ask Ray, I'd love to ask you a question. You talked a little bit about the idea of I would call it graphic medicine. And often I think in comic studies, we think about graphic medicine in the terms of like disease pathologically. But it seems to me that you're thinking about graphic medicine as a little more than just thinking about experiences that, well, I wanted to actually, I guess, ask about how you're thinking about using comics as some kind of medicine for, or a way to think through the body that's not just a kind of pathology, but is an encounter with it, I think, in a very different way.
Yeah, that's interesting because I don't know that I've ever located what I'm doing with graphic medicine. And of course, there's so many amazing examples of graphic medicine. Lisa is, one of the graphic novels that I reread probably every year or so. I am really interested in beyond the body, I would say, more than the body itself. And so I'm coming at it maybe from the opposite direction that some graphic medicine texts would, where the body can be in itself a barrier sometimes, depending on what story we're looking at. And so trying to find ways of affirming those aspects of self that are not reflected in the kind of visible, tangible world, but they are still visual aspects of identity that have a lot to do with being well. So that's kind of the area that I would locate this work in. But there is of course an influence. Thinking about care ethics are very tied to things like healthcare, even though now they're being brought out into different aspects of social sciences. And so when you're thinking about care and wellness and well-being, I think you do have to also think about the body. You have to think about how care feels. And if you're thinking about kind of emotional experiences too, that's not something that you can do without considering how those experiences are embodied. And the challenge there, of course, then is to how do you take an embodied physical, tangible experience and then layer it in with some of those more ephemeral or fragmentary imagined experiences that mutually inform. And that's something that I certainly don't have an answer for, but it is kind of my quest is to figure out how to do that in a way that that makes sense for me and also that makes sense for the people that I'm going to be working with. And ideally, creating things where both the process of creation and then the thing that we've made affirms and supports well-being. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that's really helpful. There's something I think you've hit on something really fascinating about the concept of using comics to understand embodiment, like how I think a lot about the comic avatar as both something that looks like us when we represent ourselves through a kind of comic avatar, but also that doesn't look like us, and so there's a kind of negotiation that happens there. That's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the way that I've looked at this, because I was working with non-binary communities, and there is a lot of different ways of kind of playing with the borders of the body and what can a body be. Like drag would be maybe one example of that, where you are really pushing at the possibilities of what can happen in this corporeal form that you're housed within. And I have thought about comic making as a kind of drag for that reason, because it's possible to shape yourself in a slightly different way that's challenging to do when you're just kind of throwing on your clothes and walking down the street and whatever. The potential to craft oneself when you are drawing yourself is something that's really interesting and was really important for me in my MA research, and is something that I'd really love to do more of that co-creative stuff with people in the future, to think about that, because we have different choices when we are making ourselves up as comics than we necessarily do when we're just, lumps of flesh walking around the world, to put it graphically. So, yeah, I think that's an interesting potential, and the link to avatars is certainly something that I also see.
Yeah, it gets me thinking too about, and you touched on this in your presentation. It's been something I've been thinking a lot about in my research, the representation of the other. So when we have to draw someone else's comic avatar, how do we kind of approach that ethically? And I've been thinking about that a lot as a researcher. How do I work with people who are still alive, whose work I'm looking at? And I want to approach that work in a way that treats them. I think you used a really useful phrase that works with people instead of about people. I think
Mhm.
that is really essential to understanding how we can have relationships with creators of things that we're interested in. Um, that treats them in the way that they should be treated, not as an object, but as someone who's working. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing to think about in the context of comics engaged research, because obviously you and I are coming at comics from different angles. But we create representations when we write academic literature too. Just because we're not drawing someone doesn't mean we are not creating an image of them. And so I think it can be really useful to come into this where you are working with a medium that is a kind of visible and visual representation, where people are being figured in some way, or illustrated or whatever it is. Like you have this thing that in some ways is more obvious that this is a person that you need to take care of, that you need to be respectful of, and not just kind of draw them any which way because you can. That there needs to be a lot of thought that goes into it. And something that was very challenging during my MA research is that just because I'm non-binary doesn't mean I know how some other non-binary person wants to appear in a drawing. Doesn't mean I know what their insecurities are. It doesn't mean I know what's going to, trigger a dysphoric experience, or ideally on the flip side of that, a more euphoric experience of being validated in a drawing. And so we did have to go through a kind of negotiation of trust, where if I'm going to be creating a representation of you, I need to do it thoughtfully and have a conversation with you about that before I do it. But then we also need to sit back down and look at the drawing once it's there. And you need to be able to feel comfortable to tell me, change that. I don't want to be wearing lipstick in this drawing. I don't, something like that. And I feel that that is the responsibility of the researcher to create that environment where someone does feel confident and comfortable to say, that's not how I am. That's not how I want to be. And the representation is not what it should be. And I think that if we took that level of care as well, and many scholars do, but if we took that level of care in all forms of representation, including writing a paper about somebody, whether they're alive or dead, like you try and take that kind of care and consideration that becomes so obviously necessary when you're working with visual media, but is always necessary when you're representing someone in any form. I think that is a really more careful way of working. So.
I
I
think we
have a
have time
question.
for, yeah, we have time. We've got 8 minutes, so go for
Okay,
it,
great.
Raey.
8 minutes and then the Q&A. Okay. So we had a conversation earlier in the semester about the kind of joy that can emerge from doing creative things. And obviously, that's a big part of my research with care, well-being and feeling well and all of this. But I also don't want to discount the kind of creativity that exists in all kinds of research, including, exploring an archive and what you're doing with your spy board and all of that. Do you think that working with a medium like comics encourages you to be creative in a different way? And also, are you considering joy or enjoyment of comics within your academic work? Is that sort of emotional level of engagement part of the conversation for you?
Yeah, we were talking about that a lot. We talked about different ways of that we find joy in kind of acts of creation. I know for you with comics, that's a big thing. I don't actually like draw that often. I like to sketch a little bit, but I find a lot of joy in playing music. And oftentimes, it's interesting talking about joy in relationship to research. I think something I've been trying to think about as I start a PhD is I want to find a lot of joy in the research that I do. And I've been trying to locate that in studying the place that I'm in to learn more about its history, to kind of encounter the things that I walk down the street and I don't think much about. And I want that to be, I mean, some of this history is recent, some of it is centuries old, some of it goes beyond those kinds of timelines. And it's something I want to be like. I think that this kind of historical research um, and textual research can be a really, and archival research can be a really like joyful way of encountering history, a really like unique way. There's something about sitting through the archive and flipping through something and encountering history as it kind of flies by as you're just reading headlines that is really unique. There's no perfect way to kind of find out about a historical time period, but there's something certainly different about going to an archive and having to sit and reflect and work with a very specific time period that I think is really valuable. And I think one thing you're getting at too is like the power of reflection. So just sitting with something for a long time. Um, I thought a lot about that as I just finished my MA and having sat with two books for the better part of a year and just sat and thought over and over about little stories that are in them, little moments. I think there's something really valuable when research can allow people to sit with something for a long time, and soak it up and try and work through its all the complexities that we find. I think about that a lot in text itself, but you're thinking about it through people too, and I think that's an incredibly important angle to work through reflection. Um, yeah.
Yeah. I like that you highlight that because that is a clear point of connection between our work as well as this idea of you need to be able to slow down and spend time with what you're doing, with whether you're making something or engaging with something that somebody else made. And that is often very much at odds with the way that the academic world works because we are so often very scheduled and busy and a little bit frantic. And so I think it can be a very powerful choice to decide to do something slowly and to bring in that kind of thoughtfulness and to give yourself time and space to really arrive in an understanding of something as opposed to trying to, tear it apart to get at the core and then move on to the next thing. So I appreciate you making that connection.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. There are a lot of factors that I think go into that ability even to reflect, like the amount of time. A lot of those are material factors, I think, that exist that give people the time and the space to be able to work with something for a long time or do something they're even passionate in. And I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that. But I also like I think one of the things that your beginning drawing kind of makes us think about is the ways we can take little moments and really kind of situate ourselves and try and embody something, try and work through something. And it shows, I think, in a lot of ways, the power of just sketching, of just or just doodling. of trying to do one little thing for a little moment, and to keep that and use it as a moment of reflection in and of itself. I think there's something really powerful in that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And hey, you might find that too when you're getting to know the place that you're in. Sketching is such a beautiful way of spending time in a place, whether it's, urban or landscape or anything. So this idea of drawing being something that leads us to notice more and to be able to quite literally draw ourselves deeper into a context where we're spending time. That can be a really, really wonderful thing.
Yeah.
Q&A time.
Do you feel like you've asked? I mean, there's one Q&A in the chat so far. Any final question you want to ask one another?
I have more questions. I think that it might be good to open things up to Q&A so that we can engage with the audience a little bit. And then if those questions kind of peter out, we can always revisit our own questions.
And I just want to remind people in the webinar, please type your question into the Q&A section, and I'll read from them or draw from them in the questions we're going to go with now. So the first one is, do you think the word graphic, as in graphic medicine, might be misleading? And can you think of other substitutes for this word that might make it more effective?
I mean, that's a great question. There's a lot of discussion in comics. What do we call all these things? Even among different things like cartoons. Some people, the things that I talked about today, some people take not as comics, but as cartoons because there's no movement between them. I think you're right to point out the double meaning there. There's something strange about it. Some people might say like graphic. We could change it to graphical medicine. But there is a difficulty there with language. That is certain. We could also call it comic medicine, but then we have the double meaning there that exists too. So you have to ask. It's a good question, and it's a hard thing to kind of reckon with. Yeah.
What do you
Agree that that's a challenging one. I think that comes through not just for graphic medicine, but I will sometimes say that I'm, working with a graphic narrative because it's not necessarily a novel, but it's also not necessarily a comic. So graphic narrative can have that little bit of ambiguity that's useful. But certainly some people do hear that and think that I'm creating a really graphic narrative. And that's not, and especially when, you're dealing with a topic or a subject or a group of individuals that can be the target of a lot of intentional misunderstandings. If you say that you're creating a graphic narrative about gender, sometimes that's going to be misread in a way that does create a very harmful sense of what that story must be. So I do think that we should always be very conscious and considerate of the words that we're using. But I think there can also be something of an education component that goes along with this, where these are the words we're using, and this is why. Because if we look at, graph, and this is why we go back to this kind of, writing, drawing kind of philosophy of working.
Great, thank you. That question was from Ain. I'm no last name. So the next question is from Daphne Wu. How have the structures of academia shaped your creativity? Do they encourage or limit you?
I
I
could
can.
no,
Yeah.
you go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay. I'm very, very fortunate. I acknowledge that I am in a very unique context where I have a wonderful supervisor who really encourages me to work in creativity, who encourages me to take time to draw, who really views this as the contribution to my research. The Smith Chair Arts and Engagement Fellowship that I hold is really about using art to make connections, to support community, things like that. And so creativity is really built into my academic context in that way. But I certainly do find the pace of academia to be very challenging in terms of doing creative things and having the time and brain space to do creative things, because it does take a lot of time, even just in giving yourself enough quiet and enough clear space in your schedule to sit down and make something, that's not necessarily something you can do at the drop of a hat. You do need to be able to like put yourself into a kind of zone where that's doable. So I would say it helps in the ways that I've been fortunate with the scholars I'm surrounded by. But the academic frame, I do think, can also really hinder creativity, just in the way that it really is pushing for productivity, which is not the same thing as creativity.
Yeah, I would definitely say the answer for me is both. It has at times expanded my creativity. It's allowed me spaces to do that. And then at times it is because of the stress of the academic, like Ray's talking about, the academic kind of expectations that are set, it can feel like it kind of closes down creativity, or it makes you work in a certain way. I think it's always important to keep in mind too, like the way that precarity works for students, the way in which funding is tied to kind of work, and also the way, like I think a lot about this through my MA, where I didn't get funding, and I was lucky even as a Canadian student to pay what I did for tuition. I knew people who paid much more and had to work through a lot more of the struggles than I did. So there are ways in which like academia, I think, can expand and give us the kind of creative spaces um, to do projects that I think are both important, creative, and can say a lot. And there are also ways in which the system itself, I think we have to always be like considering it and negotiating with it in order to like figure out how do we make this system more uh like more useful, or kind of have more opportunities for more people to get involved and do the creative work that they want. I think that's really, really important for me.
Okay, we've got a million questions now. So, starting with Oralia Gomez Ramirez asked about if Raey could please speak a little bit more about making as a form of knowledge, and repeat the name of the artist scholar that they referred to. Thank you. Beautiful, joyous way to start the day.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. So the scholar that I was referring to, his name is Tim Ingold, and his 2013 book, Making, is probably the greatest place to direct you to, because if you're interested in this concept, that is just a beautiful sort of tome on processes of making in anthropology, archaeology, architecture, and art, I believe, are the four kind of areas. But the idea really is that when you make something, when you engage in that process of creation that is geared towards kind of a, not necessarily a task, but you have a goal, and it's something that you are given the time and space to explore how you are going to move through that and how you are going to reach the goal. That can be a really interesting way of finding your way to knowledge, because it's not prescriptive. It's not necessarily like you absolutely must do things this way and that's how you're going to make the thing. It is very much a kind of, I have walked this way, and so you know it's possible to get through, but you don't necessarily have to walk in that same way in order to get to the same result. It's a very welcoming, I would say, kind of way of thinking about creativity, because it does focus on learning and kind of self-learning, where you develop your own understanding of something, as opposed to, as I said in my introduction, receiving knowledge that someone else has already created, which is really what we do oftentimes when we're sitting in things like lectures. Someone has created a bundle of knowledge and now they're passing it to us, and we can take it, but it can be quite passive. And by contrast, learning to do things independently and going forward and developing your own kind of knowledge, you are more actively engaged in that because somebody didn't make it for you. So yes, I would absolutely recommend that book. I think it is a really interesting approach to this. He's by no means the only one who is talking about this kind of concept, but I do really appreciate the way that he distills it. So I hope that answers your question.
There are a few questions in the Q&A about further resources, things you would recommend people read. So I'm thinking we can follow up either in a toolkit or a email blast afterwards that can include some of the titles that both of you might recommend. Here's a question from Miriam Libicki. Some of you may know her as a participant in this project. Cal, in light of Raey's thoughts on co-creation with research subjects, does it make you reflect on the different experiences of reading a cartoonist's work in an archive versus speaking with the cartoonist?
Yeah, thank you, Miriam. That's a wonderful question. Ray and I just talked about this about 2 weeks ago. I have been thinking a lot about that because typically in English studies, there's a kind of a train of thought, probably somewhere from the New Critics in the 1940s, who thought that we should take text as only text and no biographies anymore. Like we should only look at the poem for what the poem is, and we should not consider who wrote it. We should only kind of pull out the elements of it that express beauty in some way. And then that thought is, I think, taken and kind of messed with in a famous essay by Roland Barthes. You might know The Death of the Author, where Barthes talks about how criticism is moving away from that kind of the tools of biography as a way to approach literature. All that to say, this makes me think very differently than that kind of school of thought that is very common in English studies, which says let's take text for what it is and let's put the author to the side. I think like my goal is not to write biographies on these comic artists, but their biographies are really important and inform a lot of the work that I want to do. So I want there to be some kind of interaction between the two forces. It's something I've got to keep thinking through and keep working through. And I really one of the values of having a kind of cope presentation like this is that with Raey's specialty in anthropology, there can be actually like cross-discipline discourse that can happen here. That's been really helpful to have in a way that I think oftentimes in just one discipline where I'm taking courses and there's typically just people from English, those conversations don't get had. So I'm really fortunate to have that space, and it's something I want to keep thinking through as I'm just starting the project. It's something really important, I think.
Great, thanks. This is an interesting question. I have no idea what you'll say in response to this one from Meili Ao. Thank you for your presentations. Any suggestions on how to work on this perspective with blind people? What could replace or mediate the graphic narrative? Ideas?
That is a fascinating question that is very much not in my area of expertise, but I said that drawing for me is a tactile thing, a tactile way of thinking. And I think there's been some really interesting work done on the idea of haptic knowledge that we gather in some form other than, just what's up here, but how we gather knowledge through our bodies as well and our fingertips and things like that. I would be absolutely fascinated to know if there have been any studies or work done with maybe using thicker media to create drawings that stand up a little bit out of the page, kind of like raised print books. You absolutely could do that. You could do Braille comics in that way with raised illustrations. That I think would be really interesting. I don't know how useful or interesting it would be for somebody without sight. So that would be something to ask them because I don't know. But in terms of accessing that tactile, that is something that you don't need sight to do. And drawing is not only exclusively useful in the visual sense. It can be even just the contact, as I said earlier, between whatever you're drawing with and the paper, that can be a very grounding kind of experience to make something in that way and to focus on that point of connection. And so I do think there are a lot of ways that you probably could make something like that work. But as I say, this isn't an area that I've ever worked in. but that's a question I'm going to be thinking about. And if you do something with that, I'd love for you to tell me what it is.
Yeah, I think Ray's absolutely right that there's something tactile about we should like invest more in comics, something about the page itself and its feeling. But I also this is something I want to write down to look into later because that's a really fascinating question. And thank you for it. I appreciate it.
Okay, there's a question from Estefania Mile Moreno. Can you describe your process of recharging after a particularly emotionally charged drawing experience? What does a typical rest day or evening look like for you after a period of intense creative work?
I cook. Um, I think it's really important when you have drawing or sketching or creating of some kind as something that you do with your work as well as a hobby or a daily kind of practice. It's important to set boundaries for yourself because it is not the catch-all solution to anything that you're dealing with or feeling. Like it is often my go-to if I'm tired or stressed out to draw something. But as you say, if I have just done a lot of drawing and it was a very intensive kind of experience, I think it's very important to be able to recognize when you need to put it away. Because even if it is a practice that can be very supportive of your emotional well-being, which for me drawing is, you need sometimes to be able to put it away and do something different. I will say I recharge through creativity. So it just needs to be a different branch of creativity, whether that's playing the piano or cooking something or sometimes cleaning. I will do that too. That can be creative depending on how you do it. But I do think it's really important, yeah, to set boundaries and to find those things that recharge that are not the same as the work that just, took an emotional toll.
You want to say
Yeah,
anything?
yeah. For me, so it wouldn't be for drawing, but for me, after maybe like a particularly intense kind of musical piece I'm working on, I love walking. I just love walking in the city. There's something really like wonderful about getting to walk down a new street or seeing something new on the street you've been before. My partner and I will take walks and we look for the skunk that exists in the neighborhood here. It will always show up probably well, it went for like a month without seeing it and we lost a lot of hope for a long time. And then like a week ago we saw it and there's just something wonderful about encountering um, I don't know, something new and also like things that you might expect or not expect. Going for a long walk is always really, really helpful for me. It helps me clear my head and just like the fresh air. Um, Always really nice.
Nice. I hope that skunk continues to show up for you. You need that skunk. All right.
Yeah,
I have Miriam has another question that I thought addresses an aspect of your presentations that we haven't talked about yet. She writes, Raey, you talk about care and attentiveness when you create art about subjects' experiences. And you said that you wish you could make the drawings even more collaborative. What do you think about yourself as a care provider and or a vessel for another person's self-expression versus yourself as an artist who brings their own self into the work? So what are the differences here?
That's a very good question. I will say that is a question that I am continuously reflecting on is what is my role? And if I say that I'm not drawing as an artist, where is myself? How do I figure in? I will say that it's probably both, and it's probably going to continue to be both. I don't think it's possible for me to create things in the way that I do without leaving part of myself in that work. I do try to be quite engaged with what I'm doing, and so I don't have a lot of distance, a lot of the time from what I'm making. So I would say absolutely there is that component of myself being on the page as the, person creating or the person drawing. But I do also, it's tricky to say, a care provider or something like that in this context because I'm not offering therapy. I'm doing therapeutic arts. And there is an important distinction there where I'm not doing counseling sessions in my research, but I do think that I am trying to be very caring and trying to make sure that care is the foundation for the work that we do. And I would view that as something that I just view as a responsibility as a human person, is to be caring when I'm in a situation with other people and they're potentially vulnerable in some way, as many of us are at some point in our lives. We all experience vulnerabilities, especially if we're stressed or experiencing mental health struggles of some kind. So yeah, I guess the answer is it's both. I do view a responsibility of care as just integral to what I'm doing. But I'm also caring for myself, and I also have to acknowledge how my own emotional self is part of the creative work that I'm doing. But thank you for the question, because that is a sticky one that I'm carrying with me.
Okay, I think we have one last question here. Oh, no, sorry, two. What are the challenges you find when using comics as a participatory or co-creation tool? This is from Shambhavi. Challenges of using comics.
I could say something quickly on this. I was really interested in this collective. They were called Chicks on Comics. They ended like they broke up their collective probably 2 or 3 years ago, and their approach to comics, they had this long running comic line. There were about 7 comic artists from mostly from Latin America and from Europe, and they would each take a turn writing a comic, and they would do this kind of long running comic. It had something like 300 um, panels in it, and each one of them would take one, and then they would pass it to the next person, and that person. It was kind of like a game of telephone, where you give a message and it gets passed on, and it had this wonderful changing styles. It was mostly incohesive in the sense that there was no real plot, which is one of the challenges. But also, there's something like wonderful in that element of just not knowing what's coming next, the kind of surprise that would come. You wouldn't even be told who the next artist would be, and so you might see your favorite artist, you might see a new one, a new person added into the collective. That doesn't speak as much to the challenges per se, but it does say maybe a little bit about some of the potentials of even thinking about comics in different ways. That if we could think about these like collective processes, I know Ray, you talked about drawing on the same page with somebody. Like there's clearly a lot of factors that would go into that. Are you going to bump hands? Like what is the style going on? But there's also something like really, I think, revolutionary and different about those kinds of styles, about thinking about non-individualized senses of creation. There's something really, really special in that.
I agree. I think it takes a lot of humility to co-create. I think that you have to be willing not to take the lead and to invite the person or the people that you're working with to make their mark and know that you are also welcome to make your mark and that you will find a way to do that without, bumping into each other or overwriting each other or some way, unless that's part of your process, which can be fun too. And I do think that one of the big challenges in co-creation, whether it's specifically comics or something else, is that we do very often come in with our own agenda of what it is that we're going to make. And that's very normal to have this kind of vision in your head about what you're going to do when you sit down at the paper. And I think that you need to be able to suspend that just a little bit and follow instead, maybe what's coming up through the conversation, and see what the other person is highlighting more, because comics can be like a magnifying glass where they zoom in on something and they put a framer on it and they say, okay, here is something that's important. It lifts out and it becomes the focus of a panel or of a few pages or something like that. And if you're not zooming in on the same place, if you can't agree on what aspect of the experience or what aspect of the conversation is something you want to lift up in that that way, then that can be extremely challenging. And I think as a researcher, it's really important for me to remember that it's not my job to make the final call. It's not that, "Oh, okay, I hear what you're saying, but I know better and we're going to do this so that we have a better result." You can't, I think, do this kind of co-creative and collaborative work unless you are willing for neither of you to be in charge and to actually just create together, which is very challenging because that's not often the way that we're trained to work. But I think the results can be quite spectacular. So
Thank you. The last question is, I think for Raey mostly, but maybe it could be for Cal as well. Stefan Dollinger was really struck by how expansive the idea of gender, the concept of gender was in some of the interviews that you did. So the sunshine on rock, the rain, I forget the examples exactly, but I wondered, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about how surprised you were, or what your response is to those expansive ideas of gender that people shared with you.
I don't know that I was surprised. I was very grateful that they said it. Because I think if you are not cisgender, or if you have a gender experience that is maybe not the norm in your society, you get stuck in a lot of boxes, and people are very, very often trying to define, okay, but what are you? Okay, but how do I accept what you just told me about yourself, but then slot it into a pre-existing definition that makes more sense to me? And that's why, gender terminology can be very challenging. Gendered clothing can be very challenging. Gendered media can be very challenging. And so to hear from other people who've had similar experiences to me, that there was all of this possibility for how I could imagine myself, and that I didn't need to constantly be thinking about, just my sort of manifest physical representation, but that all of the sort of aspects of my spirit that this body cannot match no matter how many tattoos I put on. Those aspects of my spirit still can find representation somewhere, as in out in nature. And that was a conversation that I specifically had with one of the people that I was working with, Samson, where they were saying very often when we look around, representation does fall into two or sometimes three categories, where you've got man, woman, queer person, and the queer person category gets more and more stereotypical depending on where you're looking at it. And so to be able to put those categories aside entirely and say, instead, I'm going to find support for those aspects of my spirit, like femininity and masculinity and general fluidity and the unnamed things that we don't need to name. If I can find that out in nature, or if I can find that in the contrast between something man-made like cobblestones and something natural like rain, if I can look at that and say, I am also this, I am also free in this way, or I am also present in this way. That was really powerful, and that was really wonderful. So no, I wasn't surprised, but I was very grateful to just have those conversations, because they were very affirming, I think, for all of us as a community that engaged in that.
Thank you. I think we need to wrap up now. I want to thank our speakers and the Public Humanities Hub and the Survivor-Centered Visual Narrative Project for co-hosting today's webinar about the art of comics and engaged research. If you want to use your clap function or somehow express the Zoom substitute for applause, go ahead. There's more information about the Art and Testimony webinar series posted in the chat. We'll try to follow up with something about sources, because there were several questions about that in the Q&A, and we look forward to announcing the rest of another session in the new year. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for hosting this one.
Yeah, thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you, Cal, for a good conversation.
To you too, Raey. Thanks.